The message arrived at 17 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday morning. It was transmitted through the secure communications link that connected the task force's operations room to the classified command network maintained by the Director of Special Forces in London, and it was addressed to the officer commanding the British Special Forces element currently deployed in theatre. In the language of classified military communications, brevity is frequently its own kind of eloquence. What the message conveyed, stripped of the formal structure that classified communications require, was this: the operation that the element was currently conducting had been reviewed at the highest level of the national security decision-making process. So the review had concluded that continued prosecution of the operation presented unacceptable risks at the strategic level. The element was to stand down from its current mission posture, cease all preparatory activity related to the planned direct action phase, and await further guidance. No timeline was given for the further guidance. No explanation was provided for the strategic risk assessment beyond the phrase unacceptable at the strategic level, which is the kind of language that means precisely as much as the reader's access to context allows it to mean, and precisely nothing beyond that. No one at the receiving end of that message knew whether the further guidance would arrive in an hour or a week, or whether it would arrive at all. The officer commanding the British element read the message once, set it down on the planning table, and looked at the intelligence product spread across that table. Satellite imagery, signals intercepts, human source reporting, drone surveillance footage, pattern of life analysis compiled from 72 hours of focused collection on a single location in a single district of a city that neither he nor any member of his element was officially in. The most complete targeting package the intelligence cell had produced in 4 months of operations. At the center of that package, confirmed by 3 independent intelligence streams at a probability assessment that the intelligence officer had recorded as the highest confidence she had assigned to any location assessment in the current deployment. The precise address, the specific floor, and the estimated room of a man whose capture or death had been the primary objective of every hour his element had spent in theatre. The target was there. The window was open. The team was ready. London had just told him to stop. He folded the message, placed it in his breast pocket, and called his troop commanders in. The operation that London had ordered to stand down was not an impulsive action or a departure from authorized activity. It was the culmination of a targeting process that had been conducted with the full knowledge and support of the authorizing chain for almost exactly 90 days, a process that had consumed intelligence resources from 2 countries, aviation assets from a third, and the sustained operational effort of a British Special Forces element that had been in theatre since the beginning of the deployment cycle. Understanding why London sent that message requires understanding what the message's authors knew and did not know, and both of those things require starting further back than the moment of transmission. The target's operational significance had been assessed at the highest level of the joint intelligence process as justifying the sustained commitment of Special Forces resources. He was the operational commander of a network that had been responsible for attacks killing coalition soldiers and local security forces at a rate that had been climbing for 18 months. Not a planner in the theoretical sense, not a financier at one remove from the violence, but an operational commander in the precise meaning of the term. The man who directed specific operations, authorized specific attacks, approved the timing and methods of specific acts of violence. His removal had been assessed as likely to produce a significant degradation in the network's capacity to mount coordinated operations for a minimum of 6 months, with the possibility that the succession dynamics within the network, which intelligence assessed as contested and potentially destabilizing, might extend that degradation significantly further. He had been the subject of a joint intelligence effort for 26 months before the element that would eventually be tasked with his removal was deployed. 26 months of signals intelligence collection, human source development, pattern of life analysis, and the painstaking construction of a network diagram that had eventually identified not just the target but the architecture of everything surrounding him, the couriers he trusted, the safe houses he used, the communication methods he relied on, and the specific window in his weekly routine during which the protective measures around him were at their most permeable. The deployment of a British Special Forces element had been authorized on the basis of that intelligence product, with the explicit objective of exploiting the specific window that the intelligence picture had identified. The authorization had been given at ministerial level. The deployment had been fully sanctioned within the legal and operational framework of the relevant campaign authorization. For 90 days, the operation had been exactly what it was supposed to be. What changed was something that happened not in theatre, but in a set of offices in 3 capital cities, involving a diplomatic development whose specific nature has not been publicly established, but whose general character can be inferred from the type of language used in the stand-down message and from the subsequent pattern of events. A third-party government, whose cooperation had been assumed as a stable feature of the operating environment, communicated through diplomatic channels that the nature of its cooperation was under review. The communication was not a withdrawal of cooperation, it was a signal of its contingency. In the complex mathematics of multinational counter-terrorism operations, in which the political relationships that enable the intelligence sharing, the basing arrangements, the overflight permissions, and the broader diplomatic cover for special operations activity are at least as important as the operational capability being employed, a signal of contingency from a key partner carries an asymmetric weight. The political machinery responsible for managing those relationships translated that signal into a risk assessment, and the risk assessment produced the stand-down message. The people who generated it were not wrong about the risk they had identified. They were operating on incomplete information about the operational cost of the constraint they were imposing because the intelligence picture that had been built in theater had not, in its full granularity, been communicated upward in a form that allowed the political level to understand what standing down at this specific moment, as opposed to standing down in a week or a month or a differently configured moment, would mean in practice. The gap between the intelligence picture as it existed in the operations room and the intelligence picture as it existed in the minds of the people who sent the message was not a failure of communication in any culpable sense. It was the structural gap that always exists between the level at which operational complexity is fully visible and the level at which strategic decisions are made. This gap is not closable by better processes or better communication. It is a permanent feature of the relationship between military operations and political authority. Every special forces officer who has operated in a contested theater of this kind has encountered it. The SAS, of all organizations, has had more experience navigating it than any other unit in the British military, because the operations for which the regiment exists are precisely the ones that occupy the space where that gap is widest and where the cost of navigating it wrongly is highest. The officer commanding the element had been in the regiment for 11 years when the stand-down message arrived. 11 years in the SAS produces qualities not adequately captured by standard military descriptors. The SAS selection process through the Brecon beacons removes between 85% and 90% of candidates over 4 weeks. It is not primarily a test of physical capability, though physical demands are severe. It is looking for the man who continues past where his body signals he has reached his limit, without external encouragement. The solo navigation requirement isolates candidates on featureless high terrain in all weather. They are stripped of every cognitive support structure except the one inside them. The Hills Phase's culminating march is a solo navigation over 64 kilometers with a 29-kilogram Bergen plus rifle to be completed in under 20 hours. This has been the occasion of deaths, not training accidents, but deaths of men who pushed past their body's sustainable limits. The men who survive, who pass continuation training and the resistance to interrogation phase, arrive in the regiment as the institutional end product of a process-testing individual autonomous function under maximum pressure for over 70 years. By the time this officer had been in the regiment for 11 years, he had exercised that quality in Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and 2 previous rotations in theater. He had made decisions where the authorizing chain was unavailable and where the cost of waiting would have been measured in lives. The stand-down message was political rather than a communications constraint. But the cognitive architecture of the decision required was the same one developed for 11 years. The 40 minutes of private consultation covered 3 things. First, what had he been ordered to do? Stand down from mission posture and cease preparatory activity for direct action. It did not say withdraw from theater or extract. Standing down meant not launching the operation, but the element remained in position, surveillance running, intelligence valid. Second, how long the intelligence window would remain open. Pattern of life analysis indicated the target's location would be valid for 36 to 48 hours maximum. He moved irregularly. The current location was his longest stay in 3 months. If the target moved before reauthorization, a new targeting package of equivalent quality could not be established. The intelligence built over 90 days was declining in value with every passing hour. Third, what happened after the window closed? If London's guidance was deferred or directed permanent stand-down, the element would return, having failed to exploit the most complete targeting package developed against this target in 2.5 years. The target would remain operational. Attacks would continue. The officer asked his troop commanders 2 questions: whether the team was ready and whether there were updates on the target. The answers were yes and confirmed still at location. He needed another hour. What he did in that hour is not recorded in any document. The decision he made at the end of it was not transmitted to London before it was acted upon. The element moved from its current position at an hour that this account will not specify to a staging point selected during the previous week's reconnaissance as the optimal vehicle dispersal location for the direct action phase. From that staging point, the assault element moved on foot through approximately 400 meters of urban terrain to the target building. The approach was conducted in civilian dress and in the silence that 4-man movement in a denied environment requires, a silence that is itself the product of training. specifically of the close target reconnaissance exercises that continuation training includes, in which pairs of candidates are required to maintain observation posts within 15 meters of an enemy sentry for periods of up to 72 hours without detection, with their performance assessed by SAS soldiers specifically tasked with finding them using every available means, including thermal imaging equipment. The candidates who pass this exercise, who remain motionless and invisible in proximity to a trained soldier attempting to find them for 3 days, have internalized a form of stillness that is not natural and is not passive. It is an active, disciplined suppression of every movement impulse that normal human physiology generates, sustained over a period long enough to make that suppression itself a kind of violence against the body's default instincts. This is the quality that made the 4-man approach through 400 meters of a city in which they had no authorization to be simultaneously undetected and precisely navigated to within meters of a specific address on imagery that had been memorized rather than carried. They reached the building at a time that this account will not specify. The entry was conducted with a hydraulic spreading tool that defeated the lock mechanism on the outer door in 4 seconds and produced no sound beyond a brief metallic stress that, in the ambient noise of an urban environment at that hour, was indistinguishable from the settling of a building. The entry team cleared the ground floor in 40 seconds. The staircase to the upper levels was secured. 2 operators moved upward. The target was on the 2nd floor in a room whose position had been confirmed by pattern-of-life observation and whose specific interior layout had been inferred from the building's construction type and floor plan derived from imagery. He was not asleep. He was seated at a table, working by lamplight, with papers around him that were subsequently assessed as operational planning documents of significant intelligence value. He had a handgun on the table in front of him, within reach. He looked at the operators when they entered the room. He did not reach for the handgun, not because he was paralyzed by surprise, though surprise was present. He did not reach for it because he looked at the 2 men in front of him and made a professional assessment that reaching for it would not change the outcome of the next 3 seconds in any way that would benefit him. This is a measure of something. It is a measure of how the 2 operators presented themselves in that doorway, controlled, purposeful, without the agitation or hesitation that might have offered a calculation of exploitable odds. He was restrained and removed from the building within the 4 minutes that had been identified during planning as the maximum safe time at the location before the probability of detection by the network's external security became critical. The assault element extracted via a route different from the approach route as had been planned. They reached the vehicles without incident. The exfiltration from the operational area was completed before the next communications window opened. The target arrived at the location designated for initial intelligence processing in British custody, unharmed, with the documents from the table sealed in evidence bags and with a phone that had been removed from his person during restraint and which contained, as the intelligence officer discovered during the first hour of exploitation, a communications record that mapped a significant portion of the network's command structure in the form of a contact list whose entries had been encoded with a system whose key the target subsequently provided. The intelligence yield from the operation was assessed by the Joint Intelligence Architecture as the most significant product from any single operation conducted against this network in the preceding 2 years. Over the following 4 months, the leads generated by the target's information and the content of his documents were fed through the targeting cycle and produced 18 further operations in the relevant theater and 3 in adjacent theaters, each of which generated its own intelligence yield and its own operational output. The network's attack rate against coalition forces in the relevant area declined by 53% in the 6 weeks following the operation and did not recover to pre-operation levels during the subsequent 12-month assessment period. When the officer sent his message to the Director of Special Forces at the next communications window, describing the mission's completion and the intelligence yield, and noting the absence of British casualties, he chose his language with the precision that 11 years of operating in the gap between political authority and operational necessity had given him. He did not characterize the relationship between the stand-down message and the timing of the operation. He did not explain what happened in the hour after he asked his troop commanders to leave the room. He stated what had occurred and what it had produced. The message was transmitted through the secure communications link at 0400 hours local time, which meant London would receive it in the late evening, which meant the director could read it and consider its implications before the next morning's intelligence briefing with the political level. The message was approximately 300 words long. It contained the essential facts. It contained the intelligence yield in a form that was precise about quantities without being specific about locations. It contained an assessment of the operational methodology that would allow the director to make his own judgment about how to characterize what had happened. What it did not contain was any explicit reference to the stand-down message. That absence was itself precise. The Director of Special Forces read the message and made his own professional judgment about how to characterize it to the political authorities who had transmitted the stand-down. The characterization he chose described the completion of the operation as having occurred within the authorized operational framework and noted that the intelligence yield was exceptional. It did not describe the timeline in any detail that would have invited the question of whether the stand-down had been received and acted upon in the way that the transmitting authority had intended. Nobody at the political level asked the question, possibly because nobody at the political level was certain they wanted the answer. The diplomatic development that had generated the stand-down message had, by the time the message describing the mission's completion arrived, been resolved in a direction that was less politically sensitive than it had been at the moment of transmission. The window that had seemed to require the operation's suspension had closed before the stand-down's practical effect could be evaluated. The operation was over. The target was in custody. The intelligence was being processed. No British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The third-party government's signals had been successfully managed. In the circumstances, the question of exactly when the direct action phase had been initiated relative to the stand-down message was a question that the political machinery had strong structural incentives not to pursue. The officer, in the 26 hours after he sent the message, experienced something that had not been present during the operation itself, which is the weight of the decision separated from the decision-making moment. During the operation, during the hour when he was alone, and during the subsequent hour when the team was in movement, and during the 90 minutes of the direct action phase itself, there had been only the operational problem and the operational solution. The gap between what was authorized and what was necessary had not been a moral or psychological problem during those hours. It had been a technical and tactical problem. The problem was solved. The target was in custody. Then came the separation. Then came the understanding of what the decision actually entailed. He had issued an order that his team would understand at some point in the future when they had time to think about it, as an order to go against explicit direction from the higher command. He had gambled that the window would close quickly enough that the higher command would not have time to countermand him again. He had gambled that the diplomacy would resolve in a way that would make the higher command reluctant to publicly prosecute the question of the timing. He had gambled that the intelligence yield would be significant enough that the results of the operation would speak louder than the circumstances of the operation. He had won all three gambles, and in the moment of winning them, he understood that he had in fact not gambled at all, but rather had calculated. He had calculated that these things were likely to be true, and he had acted on the calculation. This is a form of clarity that follows decision-making in combat, and that does not arrive before. It is the clarity of understanding exactly what you have done and exactly what it has cost you and what it will cost you to continue operating in the institution that you have just implicitly rejected the authority of. He did not sleep in the 26 hours after the message was sent. He sat in his quarters and did not sleep because sleeping felt like an evasion of the weight that had arrived. The weight was not guilt. He had no guilt about the operation. He had guilt about the fact that he was not certain he would not do the same thing again under the same circumstances, which meant he was not certain he was the person who should continue to hold his position in the command structure. He did not communicate this to anyone. There were 3 people in the room when he made the decision to proceed, and those 3 people would, he knew, spend the years after the operation understanding that they had been party to something that the institution had blessed in silence. They would spend years wondering whether the blessing was genuine or whether it was merely the silence of institutional self-protection. They would never be certain. They would spend the rest of their careers understanding that they had been tested at the point where the institution's official structures ended and the institution's real structures began, and that they had been found to be the kind of people who would answer a call from that real structure without checking with the official one. This understanding would change how they related to the institution itself. The after-action review that was subsequently produced allocated 2 sentences in a classified annex to the period between the stand-down message and the completion of the mission. The sentences noted that a communications interruption had occurred during the stand-down period, and that the mission had been completed within the operational window that the intelligence picture had identified as available. The language was technically accurate and institutionally impeccable. The people who read it understood what it meant. The people who wrote it understood what it would be taken to mean. This is the language in which the institution manages the gap between what is necessary and what is authorized, has always managed it, and will continue to manage it in every future operation where that gap opens under pressure. It is the language that allows the institution to get the outcome it needs while maintaining the institutional structures that prevent it from explicitly asking for such outcomes. It is the language that requires men like the officer to calculate when the gap between what is asked officially and what is needed actually has become wide enough to justify stepping into it. The intelligence yield from the operation was, indeed, exceptional. The documents that were recovered from the target's location contained operational plans for 3 separate attack networks running in parallel, each of them at advanced stages of execution, each of them assessed by the intelligence cell as likely to produce significant coalition casualties if they reached execution. The contact list from the target's phone, which he subsequently provided access to, mapped a network command structure that included 37 individuals identified by name or operational nickname, of which 23 had not previously been identified by any of the 4 services' collection efforts. The interrogation of the target himself produced confirmation of the network's relationships with 3 other networks whose activities had been assessed as separate but coordinated, and whose cooperation had been masked from the intelligence analysis because the compartmentalization of the network structures had successfully prevented the specific linkages from being identified through signals intelligence alone. Within the first 72 hours of the target's custody, the intelligence yield had multiplied the 4 services' understanding of the network structure by a factor that the Joint Intelligence Assessment would later characterize as transformative. The intelligence that flowed from the operation fed directly into the targeting cycle that produced the 18 operations referenced in the earlier part of this account. The first of those operations was conducted 48 hours after the target entered custody, targeting an individual identified in the target's document cache as a finance manager for one of the 3 attack networks. The operation was successful. The individual was captured. The intelligence he provided identified another 12 network nodes that had not previously been known. The second operation was conducted 72 hours after the first, targeting a separate individual from the target's contact list. That operation was also successful. The cascading effect of these operations was not merely that they produced additional intelligence, they produced a cascade of disruption within the network's command and control structure. The network members, realizing that the target had been captured and that his interrogation had produced the loss of operational security for the entire network, began to assume that the entire structure had been compromised, and began to operate on the assumption that external surveillance was total. They began to implement operational security procedures that had not been necessary before and that had, as a practical matter, been abandoned because they were incompatible with the speed of movement that the network's operational tempo required. The speed of the network's operations began to slow. The coordination that had been possible when network members could move quickly and assume secure communications began to become impossible when network members began to assume that every communication was being monitored and every movement was being observed. The 3 attack networks that had been preparing attacks simultaneously began to miss the coordination windows that the attacks required and began to fall out of synchronization. The attacks did not proceed. The weapons caches that had been positioned in preparation for the attacks were abandoned because moving them without the target's logistics expertise carried risks that individual network commanders assessed as unacceptable. The weapons remained in place where they were subsequently discovered by coalition forces operating on intelligence provided by the interrogation of the individuals captured in the cascading operations. The message that reached the political level in London was that the operation had been not merely successful but transformative in its effects on the network's capability. The political level did not ask how those effects had been achieved or what relationship they bore to the stand-down message that had been sent. The political level had what it needed: a network that had been degraded, attacks that had not occurred, and a classified annex in an after-action review that did not invite deeper questions. The officer was not censured. He was not formally commended. He was assessed in his subsequent performance review as having demonstrated sound operational judgment in a complex and rapidly evolving situation. He was promoted. The incident was not marked for any form of institutional investigation. The protocols that would normally have been activated when a stand-down order was followed by a countervailing operation were not activated because the countervailing operation had produced results that the political level had explicitly hoped for and implicitly needed. In the mathematics of institutional self-preservation, an outcome that solves a problem in a way that no official process could solve it, and that produces no apparent diplomatic cost, and that generates intelligence product that validates the decision to allow it, is an outcome that the institution will protect. The officer understood this. He understood that his promotion was not a commendation for superior performance. It was the institution's way of signaling that his decision had been understood, approved in silence, and protected by the very institutional structures that his decision had technically violated. This is the peculiar signal that Special Forces officers receive when they operate in the gap between official authority and operational necessity. The signal says, we needed this, we got this, the cost was acceptable, and you are now tied to this institution in a way that you can never quite extract yourself from, because you have done something that only this institution will ever understand or protect. The operation that was never supposed to happen produced results that cannot be spoken aloud, and somewhere in a classified annex in a document that will not be released within the operational lifetimes of the people who wrote it, 2 sentences describe the hours in which it occurred with a precision so exact in what they omit that the omission is itself the record.